Good morning. Today is the second day of Chol HaMoed. It is also Friday, Erev Shabbat, the 24th of September, and we're gathered once again to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, in the thick of Masechet Shabbat, chapter 8, Perek HaMotzei Yain. The broader conversation was about how much stuff, if one were to carry it, they would not be compliant with. They would not be compliant with the laws of Shabbos. As we know, we cannot carry stuff, but it's not that you can't carry a speck of dust. It has to have a function and be of significance to the carrier. And so that's what our Mishnah was talking about. We took a detour yesterday, and it's going to continue today, God willing, to go through some, I don't know if the word is abstract or esoteric or less halachic, let's just say more thought kind of questions. At a superficial level, these sound like observations that one might have when trying to study the science of the day. Maybe taking a stroll through the zoo and you'll see different creatures and you'll start wondering why they exist. And yesterday we began an exercise of reading the explanation of the Maharsha, where he explained that in truth, all of these questions were very deep and of great significance, and they were trying to figure out the mystery of the universe, the mystery of the Galut, and the mystery of why different nations had different treatments. Was it precise? Was it thought out by God? And the assertion that the Maharsha makes, that Rabbi Yehuda is making, is that not only are all critters in the universe with precision and purpose, but even the way history unfolds and the treatment of different nations, that too is with great precision, kavana, and therefore a reason. So why does the Galut last a certain amount of time? Oh, well, that's because whatever factors Hashem is taking into account. And what else did we say? Why is it that certain nations had longer and shorter exiles? This is the Maharsha's explanation. Well, it had to do with their nature and the way Hashem is causing things to unfold. And that's the short of the Maharsha's explanation. With your permission, I would like to continue along these lines. Before we go further, yesterday we read a lot of text. I'd like to explore the rest of the Maharsha's commentary, and then we'll take a look at the Ben Yoyada's commentary, another commentator who frequently weighs in on matters of the Agada and Hashkafa thought, and sometimes with a Kabbalistic slant. We're going to cut out the really heavy duty Kabbalah, but I want to explore this a little further. So let's do that. I'm going to share the screen, take a peek at today's Gemara. And before we go into the Ben Yoyada, let us take a look at how the Maharsha explains the language lesson. So again, Rav Zera finds Rabbi Yehuda outside of his in-laws' house in a great mood, and he says, now is a chance to ask all the questions that would typically be considered too nudniki to ask. And as we mentioned yesterday, there is a certain etiquette about appropriateness of and being on topic when asking a Torah scholar, and particularly a Torah scholar of this level. We're talking about from the greatest authorities of the day. And so even though Rabbi Zera was very great in his own right, you have to be strategic about when you want to ask questions that are a little bit off topic. Zoology and history and language, those were all things that you couldn't typically bring up in a yeshiva, but you could certainly, but when the moment was seized, this is worthy of preserving and recording in the Talmud. So we're going to go back, just make sure we did all this. Yes, we did this. So now we're going to go to the next one. So the Maharsha says, why was there a whole conversation about language? And more so, notice what happened here. The Gemara, Rabbi Zera is asking about words in Aramaic. What is the significance of those words? And then the answer, the explanation is that they are actually compounds of different Hebrew words. And so basically, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying in short is that yes, Hebrew and Aramaic are two related languages. And so there are common words between the two. And that's not a surprise. We know that. It's why people that know Hebrew have an easier time, perhaps, and not Hebrew. people that know Mishnaic Hebrew and know the Hebrew language have an easier time navigating Aramaic, because let's say 1 in 10 words are actually very similar. I dare say the same thing probably applies to Arabic as well. They're related. They're related languages. They're in the same family of languages. So what's going on over here? And so that's what the Maharsha is going to address next. Lefisha Targum, who karov lelashon hakodesh, being that the Aramaic language, the language of Aramaic, which is the language that's many times used to translate Hebrew texts at a time where Aramaic was the prevailing spoken Jewish language. And by the way, Aramaic was the spoken Jewish language for a very long time. Scholars understand that in the Second Temple era, most likely the spoken language was Aramaic. And they don't just pull this idea out of a hat. Part of it is because a lot of the written correspondences were in Aramaic. And if not Aramaic, they were speaking Greek or Latin, which were other spoken languages. There's a lot of Greek inscriptions in the land of Israel. And of course, the introduction of Greek culture with Alexander the Great, as Jewish history understands it, and then the ensuing 100 years that culminate with the story of Hanukkah, was all about a debate about how much to let Greek culture infiltrate Jewish society. But what we do know is that ultimately it was very much influenced and introduced into Israel. And so there's a lot of inscriptions in Greek, not all of it from Gentiles. So much so the Talmud discusses the prospect of a Torah scroll that's translated into Greek. And then there's the famous, what's the name of the translation?
Yeah, you have that in Mamat Tzilin.
Yeah. It's a fact. It's a fact of Jewish life. As a matter of fact, let's just go back and reference yesterday's Maharsha before we go further. There was a question: why was Greek the prevailing authority in Israel prior to the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty? And then we gave an esoteric, spiritual, godly kind of perspective, but this is all very much part of the story. But back to our Aramaic. Aramaic was a spoken language in the Second Temple era. Even at the end of the Tanakh, the end of the Bible, the book of Daniel, and the latter texts, there's extensive use of Aramaic, because Aramaic is even introduced, or it is introduced after the fall of the first Beis Hamikdash and the Jewish exile, and it's strongly introduced in the Second Temple era. And Aramaic continues to be the language of many Jewish people who lived in Bavel, in Babylonia, and actually to this day, or almost to this day, there were Jewish communities who lived far off Caucasus, and I think in Bukhara and other places, in Persia, that for the longest time, the old timers spoke not Yiddish, but a dialect of Aramaic. So the dialect of Aramaic, maybe today it's becoming forgotten in the Jewish world, but until very recently, Aramaic was spoken. And I believe there are still nations today that speak a version of Aramaic. I don't know, or I don't recall which nations. I don't know if it's the Armenians, but there are people today in that region who still speak a dialect of Aramaic to this day. I think maybe the Coptics may have spoken Arabic, but again, this is not my expertise, but I believe that to be the case. Dr. Hammer, you have anything to add on the?
No, I was just questioning where Ladino comes into this mix.
So Ladino is a Jewish slang or a Jewish dialect of Spanish and Hebrew. So Ladino is from the real Sephardic, the Jews that were living in Spain and then in Turkey and in Greece, actually, where they developed their own language. But so you had Jewish dialects of Persian, and you had Jewish dialects of Aramaic, and you even had Jewish Arabic. And the thing that we discussed and we know is that there are actually many texts by the great Jewish scholars, greatest of Jewish scholars, that were written in Aramaic and Arabic, but it was a special Judeo-Arabic where the script was Aleph based. So you have Hebrew script, and the words are Aramaic, and it was a Jewish dialect. And so who used this language? Well, Rambam, or Sadia Gaon, and many other scholars of that world wrote in Arabic. And so most of the translations we have of Rambam and Sadia and others are maybe I think Ibn Ezra was like the exception. I think Ibn Ezra wrote mostly in Hebrew. But most of the Spanish folks of that generation that lived under in Arabic areas wrote in Arabic, which was the prevailing spoken and understood language of the scholars of that region. But anyways, let's go back to Aramaic for the final time. Because Aramaic and Hebrew is very, very similar. Bekama milot in many, many different words. And my favorite and easiest instance is that the word Torah, Taf, Vav, Resh, Aleph, means Shora or Shor, which means an ox. And so frequently the Taf and the Shin are interchangeable, Shin in Hebrew and Taf in Aramaic. And there are other languages, I think Dalet and Zayin. There are other languages that I'll have to take a look to. But Taf and Shin are the most obvious instances. Alkein balomar. The gam ilu dvarim b'lashon targum eino ela kitzur b'lashon kodesh. There are other words that are not so close at a first glance to Hebrew and Arabic, between Hebrew and Aramaic, and yet they too are compounds, or give me a better, what's the right word? Anyways, a development of two different words. For example, Disha, Derech Sham, Fia Targum, Orchi Sham, Gesko there, Vechin Darga, Derech Gag, Fia Targum, Oreach, Igra, Vechin Alarov, Shnigzim, Lashon Kodesh, V'derech Kitzelash. So this Gemara essentially is making the case that Aramaic is even more closely related to Hebrew than one might have imagined at a first glance. What is the value of that assertion? I don't know. The Maharsha doesn't explain if there is a value to it beyond, of course, the value of Hebrew and its supremacy. But actually, I have a feeling he's saying the opposite. I think he's making the case of the value of Aramaic. The closerly related Aramaic is to Hebrew, the more holy perhaps Aramaic could be. So that's also that's probably a more likely reason for this desire. But he doesn't really go beyond that. Hold on, let me just see. Let's see if the Maharsha gives us any. These are just like, now he just gets into the intricacies of the Hebrew language, which I think is beyond. Where's Glima? Okay, that'll be the next tomorrow. We haven't even done that yet. All right, now, with your permission, let's jump over to the Ben Yoyada. We'll do this a little faster, but I'd like to get his take on the whole story as well. So going back to the top. If you recall, the initial conversation was about goats and ewes, and then sheep versus goats and their tail, and then on and on and on. And we said, oh, in the Maharsha's explanation, dark and light, that was a question of, what did the Maharsha say with dark and light? Maybe that one was obvious. Oh yeah, why was Greek? Yeah, why was there Greek control before Hasmonean reign? All right, now back to the Ben Yehoyada. Rabbi Zera found his father-in-law on the doorway, and he saw him in a good mood, and he said, I got to ask you, or he tells himself, I could ask zoology and scientific and worldly sounding questions, and I'll get away with it. Nearly b'siyata deshmaya, why are we told the location of this conversation? So this is the Ben Yehoyada. I don't know what the Ben Yehoyada's answer is going to be, so whatever it is, I'm going to tell it to you, and we can discuss it when we see it. Although Rabbi Zera was alluding to Torah questions, being that superficially they don't sound like Torah, they sound like mili de alma, worldly matters of the sciences, like they wouldn't have the gall, the audacity to ask these questions in yeshiva. When he sees them on the doorway in a more informal setting where he's off duty, he can ask them those questions. And even those questions that could be asked out of the study hall, but not in the study hall, will only be asked when he's in a really good mood. Rabbi Zera estimated that this was a good time to ask those questions. Got to wonder how long these questions were bothering him. All right, now we're going to get a little bit of a art scroll or a Steinsaltz translation for him. So let's see. He asked first why the rams go first. So his father, the father of the Ben Yoyada, explains that Cain, again, if it gets too Kabbalistic, I'm going to skim over it, but I just want to get a flavor. Cain represents severity. Hevel, the first two sons of Adam, Hevel represents kindness, and he was born second. And so maybe he's asking, why was Cain born first? Why does Hashem put the more questionable, cruddy guy first? Why does Gevura come first in the form of Cain before Hevel? Hevel was the righteous son who was tragically killed by his brother. And so Hashem answers, this is the style of the world. We started off with Gevura, first was darkness, and only then came light. So the birth of these two children reflects the general pattern. Now, Kabbalistically, this actually makes a lot of sense. Anyone that's dabbled in a little bit of Kabbalah, the teachings of the Arizal, or if you've dabbled in Chabad thought, you may have been introduced to the notion where God has to create a space where his full intensity isn't present or felt in order for a universe to exist. Because for creatures to think they are independent and not constantly feel the fact that they're connected to God, there needs to be some concealment. And so the idea is that for a universe to exist, there needs to be concealment. And so this actually makes sense. Hashem needs to apply Gevura, a darkening. He needs to create distance between reality, or between the perception and between reality, the way the universe perceives that it's independent. And Hasidic thought frequently talks about why human beings, we all think we are the center of the universe. Every human being is the center of their own universe. But how could a person that believes in God and knows of God's existence have such a flawed perspective where he comes first and God comes second? And the answer is because that's how God created us. God creates us in a world where we don't feel his presence, we only feel ourselves. And that's by design, and that's the idea of darkness coming before light. Darkness represents a total blockout, a total elimination, if it will, of God's presence. And so that's the first explanation, why the rams go first, and then go the dark critters, and then the light creatures. And as I told you before we enter this, clearly he's taking a little bit more of an esoteric and Kabbalistic perspective. On to the second question about why goats don't have tails that provide privacy and sheep do. And the answer of the Gemara was, well, sheep provide cover for other creatures, and so God gives them with some privacy themselves. What does it mean here? Well, the Ben Yoyada says this too is a discussion about Gevura and Chasadim. Revelation, so let's just see if I can read this. So you ask, why are kindness covered, and why is severity more present? Why does our universe see misery and negativity? And so he says, concealed kindness, this is the Jewish people, where Hashem is actually very strategic and exacting about the kindness that he gives, the shefa, the energy that he gives to the Jewish people, so that it doesn't go to places it doesn't belong. Therefore, it's not evident at all. Whereas severity, that's able to be less covered up and more evident and obvious. Then he gets into deeper Kabbalistic teachings, which we're going to glance over. Then he asks, why does the sheep have a long tail? And he says that the sheep ox. And he says the word ox is a reference to the sparks that need to be refined. And so being that the ox lives in the swamp, and the swamp represents space that's not yet drained and perfected. So that represents the universe that's still chaotic, and there's still mission and work left for the Jewish people. And so Galos is long, the final Galot is long because there's a lot of work to be done. And then it's the literal answer of the Gemara was that it needs to use its tail to swat away gnats or mosquitoes. And so he finds additional Kabbalistic association with the word that he swats away the mosquitoes, and mosquitoes is the same letters as God's name, which is a reminder that we need to bring God's name into the universe. And then we ask why the grasshopper has soft horns, and the Hebrew word, the Aramaic word for grasshopper is kamsa, which is like a kamatz, and this is another reference to kindness. Then on the question of the rooster, again, I hope I'm not totally losing you. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of his way of deciphering the Talmud with great Kabbalistic messages. As far as the eyelash of the rooster, he says, well, the word eyelash or lower eyelash is, all right, this is beyond. Suffice it to say, it represents the mode of God conveying energy through the spiritual worlds. Come in. Come in. Okay, that's one way he deciphers with his Talmud, with deep, mystical, Kabbalistic, and Gematria Rimazim. Now he gives a second interpretation, which I wasn't even going to read, but it looks like it might be interesting. So I just want to start off and we'll see if it's interesting, or if not, we'll go back to the Gemara. He says, what is the story about the goats going first, the rams going first, and then the ewes? He says, easy, which are the rams, is a code for Ashirim, people of means. And there's a verse in Mishlei that says, Ashir Yana Azus, that there's an association with boldness, or maybe the ability to be a little more rude, and a person that has means, a person that doesn't need to be so a person that's not dependent on others can speak their mind and not worry about offending patrons or people that they need their help. And then he says, Imre, the ewes, that's a reference to Chachamim, to sages. And that's the meaning. It says, Divrei Chachamim benachas nishmo, sages talk softly and calmly. So what does he mean to say? He says like this: If you're going to make a conference of Chachamim and Ashirim to figure out how to deal with the city, so you'll always find that the Ashirim like to talk first, to share their viewpoints. And only afterwards you'll find the Chachamim weighing in. Interesting. I think this is probably true. And then the Gemara answers, so why is it that the people of means get to and inevitably talk first before the Chachamim? Sometimes there's dark before light. And the only way you can appreciate light is when it's first dark. And so the Ben Yehuda makes an interesting case. I'm not sure if we're all going to agree with his position over here, which is that sometimes you need to have a flawed position first so that light can come and be magnified and appreciated. That's his take on it. And here I'm going to just translate his words with great caution. This is not my position, this is his words. And so too here. Many times you find that just because a person has means, it doesn't mean they have the wisest position, the wisest opinion, and where Chachamim tend to be more wise. Which reminds me of the very sad story about in the old country, you would have a shtatz kvir. Usually you have a person that had a big factory or something, and all the Jews, or almost all the Jews, would be employed by this town, or maybe before factories, you had a guy that owned the mill, and he was the shtatz kvir, and everyone kind of needed him. And the story goes, the tragic story, I'm sure you're familiar with, one day he loses his money. And a few months later, he comes to the rabbi and he's crying, and he says, Rabbi, I understand that people don't come to me for money, but they always came to me for advice, and all of a sudden they stopped coming to me for advice. Just because I lost my assets, it doesn't mean that my mind doesn't work anymore. And it's a sad story, and I think it's a reminder that the Torah says that even when a person loses their means, you have to treat them with dignity and make sure that to continue to appreciate their value as a human being. But anyway, that's
the word in the Birkat HaKodesh.
What?
Im ein Osher ein Kavod.
Yeah. Al kein hachacham yistagu b'chveidus. And for this reason, it's the Ben Yoda says Chachamim would be wise to bite their tongue, to not speak first. Let the affluent talk, and then the Chachamim should do their best to present their position with wisdom and tact. And if the Chachamim were able to do so, they would find their appreciation for their insight multiplied and magnified. And then he quotes Mishlei. So interesting, very different take than I was expecting, but that's his take on the first idea. My taima. Now, what about the covering and the uncovered tails? So he says, ideally,
Rabbi,
yes.
What is the setting of this order of speech? I mean, it's some kind of celebration or the discussion of the current issues, or we don't know. It's just a generic setting.
I think that I can only tell you what the Ben Yoda says. We could imagine he's talking about the facts of how communal affairs work by him, and many times, which is if you're going to have a community meeting, people that are of affluence generally are given the covet to sit in front, and generally they're going to be afforded the opportunity to talk first. And that's just apparently the way nature is. But now, Rabbi Zeir's question is there significance to this? Or is it simply the one that has the Balameya Hatadeya? And so the Gemara, with the Ben Yoda's interpretation, says that there's actually strategic value to the way things tend to unfold. That's his understanding of the...
That reminds of the order of the discussion in the Sanhedrin, where the younger members had to speak first and the older members sort of delayed their expressing their opinion until later. The idea was that the opinion of youngest shouldn't be influenced by the opinion of elders. But in this setting, it looks like rich people plays the role of younger generation, and even though they are given a kavod, but in reality, it's not a kavod.
Yes, again, I want to be very careful. I don't want to project my own views onto the Ben Yoda's teaching. I suspect that in his experience, this was something that he dealt with, and so he was trying to find value in it. And I imagine what's happening is, let's say if there's something that's going to a vote, so the person that has the, I guess let's say in court, the person that has the last say has a certain advantage. And so he's saying, Shalom Aleichem, how are you? What he's saying is that although it might be frustrating, there is value to being afforded the opportunity to speak last. I think that's really what he's saying. Dr. Hammer, you're muted. Please unmute. We'd love to hear.
Three quick thoughts. The first is a football game when they flip the coin and you have the option of calling whether you want to receive or kick off.
I love it. Very interesting.
The second thing is im ein lechem ein Torah, and the third thing is Esahu Ashir Asameach Bechelko.
Oh,
as I get this.
So hold on. So the first thing, the second point is an important point, which is that rabbis belittle those who care and provide for the community at their own peril, because community is not just what's the word? It's not just accommodating or humoring those that have the meya with the daya, but on the contrary, imen kemach in Torah, and they're necessary. And so, in a different setting, from a different perspective, we'd say the reason why the Ashirim speak first is not just a cynical strategic plan on the part of the Chachamim, but because the person that is gifted by God with affluence and chooses to use it in a way that betters the community is truly deserving of the covet of speaking first. And just to add one last point, there is a Gemara elsewhere that says, in Sanhedrin, I believe, that says, Rebbe Mechabed Ashir. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi was found to give a lot of covet to those that were affluent. And the question is asked, what's going on? If Rebbe is a man of Torah, surely the greatest virtue is Torah, not affluence. And the answer that's given, and I know this is repeated many times by the Rebbe, is that this exact point. If God gives a person with affluence, number one, means Hashem trusts that person to be a conduit of God's blessing. Number one. Number two, if a person is chosen to be God's conduit for blessing and they use it appropriately, that's not an easy task. And they deserve all the covet in the world. A person that chooses to depart from hard-earned or extreme risk to accumulate resources, and they choose to share them, that comes from a very deep and holy and virtuous place and needs to be honored. So that is certainly an important teaching to bring here to restore some balance or to provide a full picture to this topic. The Reb Beryl, yes, please.
We also have to remember that it's not impossible that Usher and Chochmah come together. They're not mutually exclusive.
Correct. Although, of course, in the instance of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he was also very affluent. We find the same thing with Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. So you do find, and then throughout history, many times people of affluence are also people of Torah. And there's a very sad reason to it, which is that in the ancient world, even more than today, it was not easy to be able to go to school. And most people had to work to survive and provide for their family. And so typically it was only those that had affluence that were able to send a child or two to be educated to the extent necessary to be a chacham. And then additionally, many times because the scholars were mindful of this fact and they wanted their grandchildren to be Torah scholars too, there's many times marriages between those of people of affluence and Torah knowledge. Also, your kids are more likely to survive if they marry someone that's affluent because they'll probably be able to feed all of the kids. And so there is this interesting fact. And this goes, I know I'm way out of my space over here, but we're anyways going off a topic. This is one of the theories about Jewish genetics and why certain traits are more prevalent perhaps among the Jewish people than other nationalities. And it's because usually in other societies, the affluence would look for might or for other qualities. But in a society that in the shtetl very much prioritize chachma and Torah scholarship, well, then the most likely genes to perpetuate and survive into adulthood were the children of Torah scholars or the grandchildren of Torah scholars, and so there might have been a selection of sorts for intellect. Again, this is somewhat controversial, but certainly interesting, and might connect to this general subject. I mean, today, and I'm not sure how I feel about this. I'm not from that world, but there is a kollel society. Again, not my place. I don't want to be overly critical of something that's not my area, but there are some obscene criteria for promising Torah scholars, demands on the boy's part. If before a shidduch is proposed, the father has to say how many years of salary he's going to commit and how many homes and where, and it's quite an interesting phenomenon, which I guess is reflective of this fact that the Torah scholars, but it's something that's not always sustainable or attainable, and also you find people going into great debts to try to have this opportunity. Again, I'm not being critical, but it's certainly something that is hard for me personally to understand. I think we've covered a lot of different topics beyond our usual Gemara subjects here.
All this started with the goats.
Listen, we didn't bring it up, but now let's take a look. One more thing. Now we're going to talk about the tails and the covering of the goats versus the sheep. And he said, Pirish, okay, I'll just translate. Wise people should not be overly invested in their clothing. Or rather like this, a wise person doesn't need a uniform or fancy clothing to let people know that they are chashiv. Let their wisdom speak for themselves. I'm just going to read what he says and I'll give you my thoughts. Well-to-do people who want to assert their influence might need to purchase very high designer clothing so that others will be able to identify them as chashuvim ve'ashirim. In the ancient world, there were certain colors that were only available to royalty, and it was illegal for a non-royal to wear. Purple, that was the result of the extraction of certain hard-to-come-by dyes. And I guess In general, there's clothing. And here is my principle. And maybe totally off topic. But a person who's very comfortable in their skin, Steve Jobs could afford to dress as casually as he wanted. Usually the people that are overly concerned, way overly concerned about their apparel are people that are somewhere in the middle. They're still trying to make a statement or achieve a certain societal position. And so they'll be overly concerned about clothing. A person that's very comfortable might be comfortable wearing jeans and cowboy boots. Now they may cost the amount of my car, but the point is, at a certain point, the person becomes a little less concerned about their appearance and they can dress for comfort or for their desired style as opposed to making a statement. And I think to some extent, that's what the Ben Yoda is here is saying. Mark, are you trying to say something or are you just adjusting your camera? But again, I've been accused of underdressing and not being formal enough. So
You're consistent, Rabbi.
So I'm actually happy to have found a companion, found someone that now I'll just tell anyone that complains. Well, no one's complained, but maybe they've innerly grumbled. So now I'll just refer them to the Ben Yoda and say, listen, I follow the Ben Yoda formula. Yes.
It's interesting that only in the last decade have most of the Jewish day schools transitioned to what the Catholic schools did for 100 years in terms of having uniforms with the major justification to make everybody feel comfortable and not competitive in who's wearing Nike sneakers versus Adidas versus Walmart, whatever.
So, Doctor, I'd be curious to hear your take on that. What is your perspective on it?
Well, it's interesting you should ask, because I was actually the chairman of the board of ed at the Yavna Academy, which is up in Bergen County, when we transitioned, when we had these discussions. And I was very much in favor of having a uniform with a little bit of options within that, very few, and a different one for Friday, for Erev Shabbos. But and that was basically came out of my personal experience, particularly with the amount of time my daughter would take every morning deciding and looking in the mirror at the age of 5, 8, 10, what to wear and what did I wear yesterday, and so. But I think it was a good idea, and I see today it's followed by many of the schools, if not all of the schools that I'm aware of. So I think it was good. Of course, they go overboard when you look at them on the weekend and on Shabbos, and when they come home and get rid of their things. But that's part of our culture. So.
Well, Dr. Yashakoyev, to your contribution to that development, and I'm going to agree with you. Of course, kids will always find the workaround. So I know, just for example, in the yeshiva, where the yeshivas also didn't always have a very rigid uniform, but today, I'm saying the last 30 years, let's say, it's very much a white shirt and black pants, and it is pretty much regulated. So now all the yeshiva students have for self-expression are ties and socks and undergarments, but hopefully that's a little less, so, and I guess with kids now, they'll have to express their individuality with their backpacks and, and jewelry or whatever. But anyways, Reb Beryl.
Vance Packard summed up the general situation by saying that people who work during the week in jeans wear a suit on the weekend, and people who work in suits all week put on jeans on the weekend.
Right, that's true.
So now I need to say that it's interesting. I think we might say that our conversation today has modeled itself after the Gemara's conversation, which is our Gemara essentially is a narrative that sounds on the surface to be less Torah, but under the surface is deeply full of value and virtue and chachma. And I guess our conversations that have spun off of it, we might say have a similar a parallel, where it's not superficially Torah, but I think there's some value to it.
We also caught a cheerful rabbi to disturb him.
Well, what's there not to be cheerful about? We're sitting, we're learning Gemara on a busy Friday, and instead of running around and whatever else, we're able to sit and learn. So let's do one more segment, and then maybe we'll jump back into the Gemara. So we will not say that we didn't learn any Gemara today. As far as what does it mean that the privacy? Oh, so the sheep are covered because they cover. And the goats are uncovered. So he says the goats that uncovered, that's people that need to flaunt style to make a statement. By the way, you might say that the Ben Yehuda is sharing with us, and I'm not saying this in a critical way, that he has a little bit of a Talmud Chacham preference, let's say, or bias. And so he says, what does it mean that the sheep provide wool for others? The Chacham that the world is able to enjoy and learn from their scholarship. Therefore, it's like it's a parable or a parallel to the sheep, the wool that the sheep provides for the comfort of all. The Chacham provides something that could be for the convenience of all. And everybody appreciates their contribution. Let's say, an usher, the fact that they have something in their bank account doesn't automatically generate benefit. Therefore, they would need to put on clothing to make an impression. Alternatively, they might have their name on a plaque on the yeshiva in town, and then that would be a way that people would certainly be aware of their contribution. And there's actually some, there are many stories of families that once were affluent and they made great contributions to Torah and to yeshivas, and the circle, the wheel of life or the circle of fortune turned, and they lost everything. And they said that different people obviously have different ways of coping with that painful circumstance. But there are many people that have expressed that although they don't have affluence, they find such nachas knowing that their enduring contribution is the contribution of the fact that the Torah happens. There's a continuing effect of their contribution for Torah or for education or both. And so that would probably be a way to not need fancy clothing to let people know that they care or make a difference about the community. Now, that's one of the advantages of a lot of organizations that have stationery, and they keep the past presidents on the stationery. That's another way that people should know that individuals who made great contributions for communal affairs are acknowledged even once their terms are no longer, have passed. And so that's, I guess, a good thing as well. Camels. A camel can allude to a person that's ignorant of Torah, because a camel has one sign of kosher but not the other sign of kosher. Ideally, a person wants to have knowledge and maisa. That would be the two kosher signs. But a person that's uneducated but still full of maisa, although they're missing, there's still something very special about them. And so the short tail means that they're missing one of the components that ideally a person should have. But they have the other component, they have the maisa, and so they're not entirely abandoned. And then he goes on to talk about, to be careful, to appreciate even those that are uneducated but are full of virtue. And he says, quotes the famous Gemara, the Jewish people are compared to Kepela Hariman, even those that are Reikanim, Melei Mitzvos Kariman, even a person that is seemingly not full of Torah. And the reality is that the majority of Jewish people today don't have the luxury of spending all this time learning. Certainly in the generation of the children of immigrants who came to this country, or immigrants themselves, they didn't necessarily have the time to have a proper day school education, no fault of their own. And so the Gemara makes sure to point out there are Maleim Mitzvos Kiriman. And we shouldn't underappreciate the specialness of every Jew. And then he actually says something interesting. In a sense, there is a value to those that are uneducated and by no fault of their own. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says, "V'haged la'ami pisham," tell my people their sins. This is a reference to Torah scholars. When they make a mistake, Hashem holds them accountable as if it was an intentional sin. L'beis Yaakov chatos samet, the people of Israel, their unintentional sin. This is a reference to those that are uneducated. That even their intentional sin to Hashem is considered like a shogeg because they haven't been afforded the full opportunity to appreciate mitzvot. People in this group, of course, are not only full of masim tovim, but also Torah scholars by virtue of great investment in Torah. And so that's important. All right, let's do a little Gemara before we come to a close. And it's going to be about language as well. Here. Livusha. Well, this is actually a Hebrew word, but I guess it's also. Okay, no. Livusha, I guess, could mean clothing in Hebrew. In Aramaic, Rashi tells us this is the word for the outer coat, which is called a saruk. And it's a compound of the two words, or an acronym of the words lo busha. A clothed person no longer has the shame that comes with not being clothed. Rashi lo busha. Limnoa habusha shemechasa kol hachalakim hatachtonim hakruim miraim. So let's make certain, Rashi says, this is not a story of tznius, of modesty. This is that a person that might be shamed of tattered garments, but if they're able to have a nice overgarment, they can uncover, or they can cover up rather, the shame that's associated with tattered garments. Gelima. Gelima is also the word for a cloak. And shenasebo kigolam. It's like a golem. A golem in our terminology means a kind of creature that looks like a man, but it looks like a human and it's man in influence. That's not what we mean over here. Golem here we mean is, a golem means a clump or an unformed, unfashioned thing. And so apparently the gelima, this outer poncho-like garment, didn't have many cuts to it. It was a simple talus-like garment. And so it's unformed. It doesn't have all of the breakdown. I believe that's how we'd understand it. However, a gulta, that is a fancy, well-designed garment. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates, it's a beautiful coat. That's an acronym for gali ve'tiv. Let me take your coat. Take it off and keep it clean. Rashi, gali ve'tiv kishu yoshev megal atzmo shelo yoshev alav. When a person sits down, he reveals what's underneath it because he takes it off. Shelo yilach lecheno v'lo yishufenu bekarka. He basically picks it up from the floor. If you've ever seen, I mean, today males don't really wear robes like that on a typical basis. Maybe if you're a barrister in other Anglo countries, maybe you have something to that effect. In Canada, right? I think lawyers in Canada have to wear some kind of ceremonial
toga.
But if you've seen if you've ever seen a Jew wear a kapata or a bekesher, one of those long silk garments, you might have seen someone wear once or twice. So you may notice many people, when they sit down, they lift the back, and that's for the same reason. You don't want it to get the drag on the floor. So gali v'tiv, when you're sitting down, it becomes there is revelation. Puria. What is a puria? A bed. Sheparim v'ravin alel. That's where the next generation comes about. Parim v'ravin. Bor zinka, a dried up pit or well, means bor zenaki. I'm not even sure where the bor zenaki. This is a clean pit, clean of water. Sudra, a scarf. Excuse me.
Is it the reference to where Joseph was thrown in?
It's not an explicit reference, but it may be an allusion. But it seems like in those days where water was needed to be stored, a bor zinkta would be an empty pit. Now I don't see zinkta means zenaki. So I think really the word bor, I have a feeling, is just like in parentheses. But the word zinkta means zenaki. It's a clean pit. It's clean of water. Sudra, a scarf. Sod Hashem lireyav. I don't know if this is like the literal etymology of the word or a remez in the word sudra. A sudar was a kind of scarf, I believe, that was worn by the Chachamim. Steinsaltz, sudra. Oh no, well, it's a head covering. It was a scarf that was turned into a turban. Sod Hashem lireyav. And so I guess the head being covered is a reference to the head covering of the Talmidei Chachamim. Apanda, a palace, a palatial structure, a palace, is an acronym for Apitcha Dain. Everyone comes here for judgment. Because in ancient times, the king or the local authority would also many times be the judge. All come here for judgment. Dain doesn't mean judgment, it means come here, or people actually. It means the masses. This is the door for the masses. Taner Rabbanan, our sages teach, Shalosha, Kozman Shem Askinim Osifin Gvura. There are three critters that with age they become stronger. So this seems like totally on another subject. The Eluhain, these are the animals that get stronger with age. Dag, a fish, Nachash, a snake, the Chazir, and a pig. And this is a glorious way to close out a very interesting series of discussions in the Gemara. Again, not entirely evident how they are Torah until we dig a little deeper.
Rabbi, any suggestion of why these particular words, which are all over the lot, we look for the source or whatever you want to call it?
I'm not sure. Perhaps on Sunday we could take a little more time to explore, but I'm not sure. I'm feeling these were probably common words that were clearly an acronym for Hebrew words. Interestingly enough, really fast, the Ben Yehuda says these three creatures allude to three nations. Dag, fish, which are more pure and less, or at least of their fish, there are pure species. This is the Jewish people. The snake is a reference to the nation of Ishmael, the Arabs. And the Chazir, the pig, is a reference to Edom, Esav. And so what does it mean they each get stronger? These are three nationalities that have their identity preserved the longest. I don't know why the Chinese don't get an honorable mention here, but anyways.
Were the Chinese back around at the time of the Gemara?
I don't think the Chinese, but I think they were around, and I think there were some Jews that traded and traveled there, but I don't think they meant a lot to the Jewish people then. We'll find out what they mean to the Jewish people in the next 50 years. But anyways, my dear friends, I want to thank you all for joining us on this Chol HaMoed Erev Shabbat day. Although very much a different style Gemara, I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful day. Let's just mention we are learning and prayerful wishes for the speedy healing of Rita Bas Leah and Leah Bas Rita and Leiloi Nishmas Daniel Yerachmiel Ben Gedalia. We have only good news for all of Klal Yisrael. Agit Yontif, Agit Moed, Agit Shabbos. See you with Hashem's help on Sunday. Thank you all.
Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos.
Shkoch.